The Paula Show is on. The Paula Show. Come on, one and all. I extend an invitation to the Paula Show. Join in the conversation. Transforming behavior, recognizing our savior, overcoming hurdles, achieving dreams. Together we can succeed.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of our 3-part conversation with historians Miss Angela Black and Mr. KamaliMannix. We're speaking primarily about slavery, emancipation, and reparation. In part 2, we spoke about the Middle Passage, purchasing of slaves at the auction, and tonight our conversation continues with emancipation, establishing villages, Barbuda, and reparation. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Stay with us, please. Thank you for staying with us on The Paula Show. Remember to watch The Paula Show via CTV Channel 2 on Tuesday nights at 9, and Sundays there's a rebroadcast at 1 in the afternoon. The Paula Show inspires, entertains, and transforms behavior. Like me as well on Facebook, The Paula Show. It's our 3rd week of history, and Angela Black is here, KamaliMannix is here. Boy, I'm spending a lot of time with you guys. And the history that I learned at the Antigua Girls High School, you're revolutionizing it, because one thing stood out for me. I never realized that there were black slave owners. And then I thought of the plantation owners raping the slaves. But in my mind, I never thought of the black male slaves themselves raping the female slaves. The atrocities, to me, were mostly done by the other color, as opposed to black against black. So thanks for the revelation, opening my eyes. And the Paula Show is about inspiring,
yes,
entertaining, but most of all, transforming behavior.
Okay.
And you guys are doing a number on me. My behavior is being transformed. Thank you very much. And I'm sure my audience as well. The British Empire formally abolished slavery in its colonies with the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. However, the Abolition Act immediately freed few slaves, except for in the cases of Antigua and Bermuda.
Bermuda, yes.
Where the colonial governments rejected apprenticeship and fully emancipated slaves in 1834. Why would they choose to do that?
Well, there were 2 rationales given.
Yeah.
Especially in the case of Antigua, the cases were actually valid. The first thing was the standard of living in terms of the quality of life of slaves in Antigua and Bermuda as well was seen as a bit better. So, there necessarily needs to be a transitionary period where they move from being uncivilized to being civilized. The second rationale was this: there was no other place for them to work. Whereas in places like Jamaica and Guyana, they could move from the estates, go other places, create villages, create complete economies, etc., etc., of course within a colonial setting. In Antigua, the only place where they could live was on the plantations. The planters even went as far as, some people would say, oh, there wasn't available land. The reality is, down to this day, there is still a whole bunch of empty land in Antigua, much less in 1833.
You don't think they have owners?
No.
A lot of them don't. I'm going to tell you why. They're considered crown land. Because leading up to emancipation, the masters were aware if you emancipate them, they're going to move off of their estates and they're going to settle on the unclaimed land. So what they did in a lot of the British colonies, they passed the Crown Lands Act to say any land that isn't occupied or owned presently is now Crown land. It is owned by the Crown and the government.
To have
so if you want
control again.
So if you want it, you have to apply to the colonial government.
But hold up. Some of the crown lands that are available now, remember, we need them for agriculture. We can't use all of them for recreation, building hotels and housing. We need some for agriculture. Okay, you agree? Okay, you may continue.
Right. And so that was the reason why we didn't have apprenticeship.
Yeah.
But the reality is the Emancipation Act actually set out that the apprenticeship was supposed to be for 6 years. And after 4 years, they just cut it off completely. because the British government was like, look, let me tell you something, right? It doesn't make sense to lengthen it out. It's best that we just emancipate them and set them free and let life move on.
Can I add a little to this?
Yes, of course.
In addition to what Kamali was saying as well, in Antigua, at one point they were trying to attract more whites to the colonies because they kept complaining that there were too many blacks. So they wanted to whiten, to bring more Europeans in. And so they tried to lure British citizens to come to Antigua by setting aside 10-acre plots of lands all over the island for those as a gift.
So you're offering them 10-acre plots
of lands, yes.
And the people who are living here, the Africans.
At the time, this was during slavery time.
Fine, but the Africans can't get anything?
No.
No, because you're black.
I don't think she understands the whole policy of colonialism.
You're black.
You're black.
I
You're black. You
understand.
can't get nothing.
But the more I'm learning is the more I'm outraged.
And the more you realize how hypocritical it was. But yeah, that was the reality.
That was the thing. And then
and not much has changed.
And
Go
then
ahead.
just after emancipation, what they did, similar to what Kamali was saying, they annexed these lands to some of the plantations. So it's not like they were not in a general historical narrative. They would say the small islands did not have available lands. Antigua had empty lands that could have been occupied by the blacks, but they were not made available to the blacks.
And probably too
by
the
law.
Cost. And if they attempted to buy them, the cost.
No, and then what they did, we're heading ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but what they also did after emancipation was to ensure that when they were selling the land, it was expensive, and the lands that they sold were in very small portions of the land, so you could not even have a subsistence type of living on the land. You had to go back to the plantation. Yes.
And whatever
about 50 by 100 plot.
So you always
have to go back to the plantation. Another for the emancipation as well, with the decision to end enslavement in Antigua in 1834.
But one second. I don't want to miss this point. So the act was passed, and Britain compensated the planters because
they were losing
slavery
property.
was abolished.
Yes, and so one of the conditions, or whenever you have the passage of the passage of legislation, it is usually a negotiation process.
Okay.
And so the theory or the approach of the British government was, okay, we are going to emancipate your slaves. They're going to take your property from you and set your property free. In exchange for that, we will compensate you.
20 million.
So the British government set aside in the Emancipation Act of 1833, 20 million pounds. So the 20 million pounds that they would have set aside in the Emancipation Act of 1833, if you were to translate its value to now, it would be in excess of billions and billions and billions of dollars that they would have set aside to compensate the masters for loss of property.
And what about the slaves?
The slaves got nothing. The only thing they got, emancipation was, not emancipation, apprenticeship was their reward. So they're saying to them, you know what? We're not going to have your slaves. You're going to be apprentices. So you'll be free.
You're free,
but you
you
comply to
work.
Still work for the estate. I know the master can pay a little salary if he feel like, you know, and you just go back to the plantation. But at the end of the day, we're going to give 20 million pounds. Yeah, I'm doing you a little favor.
But the planters got 20 million pounds. And here's the sad thing about it. I think they stopped paying the descendants, not slave masters, the descendants of slave masters in 2010. That's when they finished paying
loan for the 20
We are going to be speaking about reparation in the last segment of this program, and that's the reason why it's important. So they got compensated, and we got nothing, and we are still suffering today. Ms. Black, do you want to add to the conversation?
Well.
Let's hear this. It's another revelation, because I've gotten quite a few.
Well, I just wanted to add that when Antigua was going to give the full freedom to its slaves, it wasn't because of any benevolent reason.
Oh, you return to that benevolent.
Yes, back again. The measure was passed by one vote by Dr. Nugent, and it was because it was more economical to free them because you could use a third of the slaves to do the same work that a whole. So if you had 30 slaves, all you needed would be 10 to do the work, and the others are hangers-on. So you just needed 10. You paid 10, and the 10 would have to take care of the other 20.
Imagine.
That's basically the idea. And so it was not any benevolent reason, not because, they were nice to them or anything.
Business.
And Antigua was the only island, sugar-producing island that was set free. Bermuda was not producing sugar at the time when they were set free. It's a little tiny island. And Antigua was the only sugar-producing country that actually freed its slave in 1834.
Apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the hypocrisy about it, because the weird thing about it is the British government expected that on the night before emancipation, that July night, that, you would have had about a whole bunch of drunkenness and people getting on wild and people doing the worst things. And the weird thing about it is,
so they thought people would behave like carnival.
I was going there.
People got up and went to church the next morning.
Exactly.
It was a Friday morning.
They went to church.
Oh, praise
they
the Lord.
They found themselves in the house of the Lord.
Yes.
And the sad thing about it is the family had to go back to their states because there were no free people but apprentices.
But at least
Paula,
they knew where and when to give thanks. So therefore, carnival is not a true representation
it has for the most part
of what the slaves did at emancipation.
But Paula, okay, before we go to carnival,
yes,
Emancipation Day was actually a Friday, not a Monday. Let me say it again. Emancipation Day was actually a Friday, not a Monday.
You're not going to allow anybody to change a holiday. It's a Monday and a Tuesday.
I am just telling you.
It's a Monday and a Tuesday, girl.
The first was on a Friday, and then the following Monday, they returned back out to work. So, however we choose to celebrate our emancipation is totally up to us now. So if you want to do so through carnival, let it be done according to how you want it to be done.
Appropriately.
We don't have to, we don't have to do that. We can do it how we so choose as well. Yes, we can.
Give thanks.
Yes, we can.
Picnics, family outings.
And that's the thing about it. And that's what I like, because it even showed you how exactly white people viewed the slaves, because at the point in time they were slaves. They were savage, they were barbaric, they were uncivilized,
and we surprised them.
And we surprised them. Because
and
when they thought we would have been getting on, we got to behavior, black people found themselves in the house of the Lord.
We were somber.
And they were happy.
Remember, I told you, I think sometime earlier, that after the King Court conspiracy, that the churches began, the planters began to bring the churches in.
We're going to discuss that in the next segment.
Okay.
All
right.
So, yes. So, we're taking a break from the Paula Show at this time. Interesting conversation. I am a geography girl, but this history with Mr. Mannix and Miss Black, it's just off the chain. I wonder if I should now undertake a degree in history before you answer. We'll be right back. Stay with us, please. Thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. We're going to the rural communities and the poverty acts. I can't believe poverty acts. So the people after emancipation, some stayed on the plantation and some would have moved away. I understand that Point, Villa and Grace Farm, these were rural areas where people would move so they could be closer to the city.
A lot of people try to get jobs in the city. They try to move away from the plantation. One of the things that the people were very happy about is that they could move from one place to the next. They could go around and find their families and so on. And so a lot of them traveled all over Antigua to find families, left plantation and went to other plantation to work, to be with their families. But then there was those who settled outside of St. John's, such as Grace Farm and so on. I don't know if it's okay for us to say it's a ghetto kind of situation, but people lived in a slum area, in those slum areas, so they can get jobs in the city. So people were now basically trying to move away from being laborers on the plantation to improve their lives. So they were washerwomen, seamstresses, skilled workers, fishermen,
mechanics,
blacksmiths, and so on. And a lot of them would live not only in that area, but other parts of Antigua. They moved away from the plantations.
But generally, even in India, Mumbai, and even in New York and those places, you have Manhattan, but then in the Bronx and the other boroughs, you have the ghetto areas because people are just not able to afford housing in some of the upscale areas. So it's okay to say ghetto, because to me, ghetto sounds much better than slum, if you ask me. And the planters, they rented the lands near the plantation.
Some of them did, so that they could keep their labor force close by.
And the slaves received wages.
Yes,
low
the
wages.
free men.
Yeah, because now they were free, yes.
Because they tied them with the Contract Act to the land. They did everything possible to tie them to the land.
Because they needed the labor.
Right. And this did not stop until maybe the late 1950s, going up there.
That was recently?
That was recently, yes.
The trade union movement.
Yes.
After the trade union movement, people began to, but back then, they did everything. They passed laws to ensure that the people were kept on the plantation.
Like the Rent Wage Act was one?
The Rent Wage one was an act that they passed to say, okay, now the house you were living in when you were slaves is my house, so now you have to pay rent. But you don't have to pay rent. All I'll do is just pay you less money, and you work. So they were paid money, but they were paid less money.
Because you have to deduct the cost
of the rent. That changed, though, after 1843. So we had a major hurricane. And so they could not afford to rebuild the huts. So that was where they began to rent lands out to people now, or to sell lands.
So you're responsible now for constructing your own home on the land that became available to you. What was this Vagrancy Act and the Licensing Act?
Okay, so you had, in addition to that, also the Policing Act.
The Policing Act?
The Police Act, yeah. The Vagrancy Act, if anybody was walking on the street and they looked like if they were a vagrant, they would arrest them,
but this sounds
put
like
them in
America,
jail.
Where you're walking on the street, you're a young black man, and they think that you're bad, and you're a thug, and they just shoot you, bam.
Yes. That's what it was. You would go to prison and you would work.
Oh, at least you go to prison and work. They didn't kill you.
They didn't kill you.
That's a better system.
Well, maybe that happened too.
Maybe they killed.
The Licensing Act, if you want to have a business, if you want to go to the market to sell anything, you had to have a license. And the Police Act, even though you worked on a plantation, you had to ask the owner of that plantation for permission to leave to go and sell your stuff. So even though you were free,
that's not total freedom.
The system restricted.
Because there's so many strings.
Right. The system continually in Antigua continued to erode the freedom of the people until 1939.
The slaves were not able to sue the masters.
No, they couldn't. We didn't have apprenticeship. We only had one stipendiary magistrate, and he was just there for official purposes,
and
really.
We spoke about those stipendiary magistrates,
yes.
little old white man from England
so
who's retired, probably sleep,
can't be bothered.
Couldn't be bothered.
No, it wasn't all like that, Jack. Y'all are making it so
From what I read.
From what I read.
That was
in a lot of cases.
Some of them really tried, but it just wasn't enough. They weren't enough. So in Antigua, even though you could go to the court and solve a problem, normally the court would find in favor of the master.
Of course.
And so you found a lot of acts against humanity continued to happen in Antigua during that period between 1834.
To ensure that the people were kept in poverty.
Yes.
And it's also a psychological type of abuse as well.
Yes.
You can't do any better on your own, so you might as well stay with the master.
Yes.
And that was the theory. The good thing about it is, though, it didn't last for long.
Good.
It did not last for long because eventually people broke out of it. We would have had a situation where people would have now started to move about, and people would have moved away from the plantations and would have actually lived in villages.
Okay, so we're going to be speaking about villages in the next segment. But I just want to end this segment with something that seems so incredible. A donkey tax?
That was in the 1920s.
Right, but what's a donkey tax?
The donkey tax was a tax that was levied against anybody who didn't have property on who had property or who had less property on the 50 acres of land in Antigua.
So you had less than 50 acres of land.
So if you had less than 50 acres of land and you had an animal, a horse or a donkey, you would have to pay a special tax. But if the planter had more than 50 acres of land, which is normally the case, they would not have to pay that for their horses, their donkeys.
And clearly the slaves might have 1 or 2 donkeys, but the master would have many horses and many donkeys.
They would have. I think it was passed in the 1920s. It was quite funny when I encountered it,
and that's
actually.
why I asked you about it.
Yes, and I think a lot of people knows about the donkey tax.
Well, this is what the Polish show is about.
A lot of people didn't know about the donkey
their
tax.
television wondering
Wasn't
what's
there a dog
coming
tax
up
at one
next.
point?
A dog tax too?
I think there was a dog tax, but that had nothing to do back then. I
With
think it was a
slavery.
license. You had to pay a license for your dog.
We still have
We still have to pay that.
We still have to
now-
pay a license.
Now it's
we don't.
sophisticated because you get a chip for the dog.
So don't tell nobody.
really?
So don't
Yes,
tell nobody
you
have
get
a
a
dog.
chip for the
You just don't
dog.
enforce it. You didn't know you have to pay radio tax and TV tax and
and
so.
radio tax. And
Yeah,
TV
I'm aware
tax.
of that. Yes, I'm aware
I
of
don't
those
understand.
things.
Listen,
It's leave it
all
quiet.
these
Hush.
taxes, I don't even
They're on the
understand
books.
some of them. Lord help us in Antigua and
But Paula,
Barbuda.
can I just say one more thing before you go? I think it was in 1900 or 1901, they reintroduced the whip. And on that note,
We end on that note, the reintroduction of the whip.
so slavery continued.
So slavery continued. What's new? As a matter of fact, you know, there's a sophisticated type of slavery still practiced in this world. We may
Human
not be
trafficking?
getting, we may not be getting whipped. We may not live on the plantation, but there's still some attitudes of slavery. And I
Yes.
tell you, we black people, we're not going back there. And Paula Constance Monica Edwards Lee, I refuse to be anybody's slave. Jesus Christ, yes. Mortals, no, it's not happening. Thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. We'll be right back. Stay with us, please. Let's talk about the establishment of villages and education, village life. The first village was established.
So, yes, our first village that would have been established in Antigua and Barbuda would have been Liberta. And of course, if you drop the A off of Liberty, you add a Y, you get Liberty.
Liberty.
And so essentially what it was, you had in Britain groups of missionaries, well, missionary societies, and essentially there'd be people who would go around Britain and raise funds to send to missionaries in the Caribbean for them to do different things.
Yeah.
One of the popular things that they would do, buy old estates or buy very large plots of land, split them up into small pieces, and then sell them to the farmer enslaved.
So that
And
sounds
that
like
is
a
how-
good plan.
That is a good plan. And so villages like Liberta would have popped up from that. In addition to that, you would have had Freemansville.
Freeman's Village. I'm from Freeman's Village.
Yes,
Yes.
and then
Papa
you would have had...
Sammy.
Freeman's Village
shoot hard
actually,
labor.
Freeman's Village actually was bought like how you spoke about. You have a Methodist church there, an old Methodist church
Very
there.
old.
I think it was the Methodist who actually helped to buy a lot of that land in Freeman's Village.
And sold the
and,
tract.
and
give
gave
it
it to the
to the farmer
but in
slaves.
Liberta what they did was to sell very small pieces of land to the former slaves, to the laborers now, very small pieces.
Oh, so after emancipation, they're now laborers.
Yeah.
They're
They're
not
no
laborers, they're
more
no longer
slaves.
slaves.
No,
Please.
They're laborers.
Given the context of this conversation, they were always slaves.
Well, from a official
From an official
perspective, it's no
standpoint.
longer slaves. You
They're
can
now
say that they're
laborers.
unfree.
So
or
why don't we
peasants.
speak?
We can say they were
Why
unfree
don't
people
we
still.
speak the truth on the Paula Show? Because I'm about truth.
Because
and
on paper they were enslaved.
They were enslaved, so we
about
have to
truth
be
and
They're
reconciliation.
right.
But yes.
you see, you can also say unfree persons because that is also truth.
Well, unfree.
They were unfree.
Yes, but so, yes, going back to the villages now.
Oh, you want to stay in villages?
There is a book written that actually tells you the way how a lot of the villages were named.
What's the name of it?
So, for example, All Saints was created because two things. One, the village itself sits on 3 parishes, St. John's, St. Paul's, and St. Peter.
Right.
The next thing, the village started because you had missionaries who came to Antigua, who built a chapel, and then the former slaves built their houses around the chapel. And the name of the chapel, coincidentally, was the Chapel of All Saints. Right. You would have had villages like Wilkes, which is the original estate. and the name of the estate owner was Will Hickey's. But you know, Antiguans, we tend to cut things and contrive, and then eventually
I'm sure Glanvilles and Seaton would be
quite a lot of them.
Yeah.
Right, they
Quite
were
a lot of
estates.
them were named after
Jennings,
the estates.
Otters,
Yes.
they were estates.
But so we need to change those names.
Yes.
Freeman's Village should be called Paula's Village.
Paulusville.
Well, I'm not
Why
going
not?
to-
Oh, I like that. Paulusville.
I think
Yeah.
Bug Peak should have been named Angela, Miss Angela Black, and not. Okay, let's move on.
Well, hey,
But yes,
we're
and so
just sharing
the
information.
names of our villages actually are interesting, and so you would have also understand why in a place like the United States it's easy for them to build these massive highways that just go straight for miles and miles and miles and miles.
Martin Luther King
It's more
Drive.
difficult to do here because our roads bend and they twist according to how people settled
Yes.
and how the houses were built and where the estates were.
Don't worry, we'll
Yes.
get some leaders who are willing to make that
Change
radical,
in the
not
interest
just
of-
change,
Can I-
a radical shift, and we'll have a shake.
Can I interject something here too? Immediately after emancipation, the laborers, many of them, began to live prosperous lives. When I say prosperous lives, they were able to add to their homes, you know, buy clothes for their children, send their children to
Have
school and so on.
businesses.
They were getting to the point of having businesses, and because they were living on the plantation still, they had a good deal living on the plantation, practically rent-free. But then remember I mentioned the earthquake after 1834. That was when you saw a great amount of free villages now
Because the
being
huts were
formed
destroyed.
because of the
Yes.
earthquake. And so before then, though, people were very blacks wore shoes, you know, had nice clothes to wear to church and so on, bought tables and chairs and beds. But then, after then, there was a gradual decline in the living standards of the blacks until it got to 1930, the 1930s.
And what would have caused that?
They never raised their pay, and the plantations.
So low wages.
Very low wage. It remained almost the same for nearly 100 years. Almost no change for nearly 100 years. And in addition to that, the plantations began to change from planter-owned or family-owned to business-owned.
Yes.
So you had what is known, that is where you would hear Papa Bird talk about the
And
syndicate.
the Antigua Syndicate
The Antigua
estate.
Syndicate
Yes,
estate,
yes,
right? Because they became company-owned now. And so a lot of changes began to take place without the consideration of the laborers.
Good change would be the blacks receiving education.
Yes,
Especially
because
from the missionaries.
from the missionaries, some of them had to pay, and they could not eventually pay for their education. And then many of them also wanted their children to grow up to become 12 years old so they could go and work in the plantations. To augment family salaries, wages, and so on. In addition to that, you had a lot of people who migrated, a lot of men who migrated, and men tended to work for more than women. And so you had a lot of families that were matriarchal, and enough money was not coming in for the family.
But it seems as if not much has changed.
Not much has
No.
changed in terms of that respect.
In
terms
terms
of
of
the family
history,
structure,
yeah.
it has quite
And not
firmly
much
remained
has
the
changed
same.
in terms of the low wages either. Yeah.
Most people in this day and age work just to survive.
Exactly.
I think, so even going back to Miss
Far
Black was
less
saying,
than they
with
deserve.
over 100 years without the salaries changing, because I think the original salary set out for the farmer sugar
It was
workers was
10
actually
pence
set,
per
and it was
man.
set by
It's
the
about
British
10
government.
pence
After
per
that,
man.
with the absence especially of trade unions that negotiate salaries, it was very easy for the masters to say, well, if it's 10 pence, it remains 10 pence because there's nobody
Or
advocating.
if you said something that was disrespectful, they would not pay you after
But
you're done
listen,
working.
Trade unions were strong pillars in our society.
They were blessings.
Even trade unions are shifting now. And so sometimes when you hear the conversation, you wonder if the trade unions are pro-employee or pro-employer. So
You have a point. I'm picking that up.
you're
have a
picking that point up. I have
Yes.
been watching the landscape, and I am noticing that they're not as strong as they were in the past. But then we have to do a program on trade unions. We move on. I understand that in other colonies, the masters were averse to the missionaries educating the slaves. However, in Antigua, I guess it was tolerated, or it was
It was
allowed.
allowed. It was allowed. After the 1836 conspiracy, they began to bring the missionaries in, invite them. They allowed them to come in. They tolerated them. I know that the Methodists came in the 1850s, and then the Wesleyans followed, and the Moravians followed. Note, I did not say the Catholic nor the Anglicans, because they were the churches of the planter class.
And they were here from day one.
Right, they were here from day one, but they were normally the churches of the planter class. Not knocking anybody, it's just a fact. Okay?
So you don't have to apologize for them.
Right.
It is what it is.
It is what it is, yes. And so you even had planters who would sit and have church with their slaves in the backyard. Gilbert was one of those who did that. And so
he might have been considered benevolent?
Benevolent, for the most part. Right, you see you're starting to get it.
Because she's been using the word so often.
Yes,
benevolent.
Yes. So the Antiguan laborers, they were very spiritual. They were Christians.
And you said
many
they
of
knew
them
the
were,
law to some extent.
and they knew the law to some extent. They were very keen on the law, so that they would not go outside of the law, but so that the master, the planter, would also not go outside of the law. Even though when the planters did, sometimes there was no justice.
The thing is, I'm gathering from this conversation as well that there is a myth that Antiguans are submissive. It's not that we are submissive.
Antiguans are not
watch
submissive.
the landscape.
To see when to react.
And we like to react in that, with that element of surprise.
Yes.
Can I go back to the point that she was making about the church?
Sure.
No, of course Antigua is a Christian society. The reality is the church has been important from since day one. It was actually the Catholic Church that gave permission to Spain and all the others to actually indulge themselves in the slave trade. When you had the movements for abolition, you actually had some churches that stood against it, and that was a reality. We tend to, as Antiguans, we all know a big church. The cathedral in the city that is the Anglican church, you know, we celebrate, is a beautiful building, a building built by slaves, but slaves had to worship. You know where the Apiary building is?
Yes.
Right. So these
the
people were the
side.
laborers who built the cathedral that
And
we
they
celebrate.
didn't have access.
And they didn't have
And it
the
was a
ability
church.
to worship in that building, and it was a church. It went as far as the Anglican Church owns slaves. The Catholic Church owns slaves. And that's a reality that everybody knows, but they tend to try and keep a secret or to deny it. And the truth about it is reality. And that is why churches like the Moravians and the Methodists and so on were so essential.
The reformists.
Right. Because what they did, they said, okay, we don't see you as servants. You're not the descendants of Ham. You are people. You have a right to know God. You have a right to be educated. You have a right to be treated as a human.
In all our conversation, we've mostly spoken about Antigua, but it's Antigua and Barbuda. So there were slaves on Barbuda, because I read that the Codringtons established a big slave farm on Barbuda, and this is coming from the Commonwealth website, where children were bred to supply the region's unpaid labor force until slaves were emancipated in 1834. So there is some truth that...
I prefer to find, I'm not saying it's not true, but I would prefer to have the primary evidence of it, the primary source of it.
Even though it's from the Commonwealth?
Even if it's from the Commonwealth. Because it could have come from, I have not done that research, and I'm not going to say what the Commonwealth is saying is incorrect, but I don't like to verify something that I have not
So
verified.
what do you know of slavery on Barbuda?
I know that there were slaves. I was told when I was a little girl that they were there. They bred slaves there, and they would bring them over to Antigua to work. I was also told that the slaves were great divers, because they were the ones who salvaged ships that were wrecked and so on on the coast of Barbuda. In fact, there was a ship that was wrecked in the 1890s. Chinese, Asians, They rescued them. They took the ship. But these were not slaves when they did it, but they were really good at diving and so on.
And
So
salvaging,
that much I
okay.
know. And
But you must know that Mr. Codrington
Yes.
owned Betty's Hole.
yes, I do know
You know
that.
that too.
Yes, he did.
He's actually
yes,
a renowned
he did.
slave master and plantation
Very
owner, as a matter of
renowned.
fact. He,
Very renowned.
If you could ever speak of one man who came to the Caribbean and managed to really make a good profit off of the Caribbean, it was Sir
It's
Christopher
Codrington.
Codrington.
Didn't he
Codrington,
have
yes.
other estates
In other islands.
in
Yes,
other islands
Yes, he
as
did.
well?
In Barbados,
So-
the Codrington
Codrington.
College
That the
College,
Anglican
yeah. It's
Church
named-
used to train their priests. Let's
is
add
named
that too.
after him.
Because, so, Christopher Codrington is a very interesting individual.
Yes.
So, first of all, he owned the entire island of Barbados was considered his estate. So what he did, he took a 99-year lease from the government of Antigua to lease the island of Barbados as his personal estate.
So what did he pay?
Right? He was supposed to pay, I think it was a sheep.
One fat sheep
One
on
fat
demand.
sheep
On demand.
on demand.
One fat
Right.
sheep
If
on
demanded.
demand.
If demanded.
So if they said,
For what?
don't send
Per
the sheep-
year.
Per year.
Per year, one
That's
fat
the
sheep.
lease,
So
yeah.
if they say, no, we don't really need the sheep this year, then he practically could go for
It's
almost
free.
100 years with using the island as he so desired.
Wow.
He also owned Betty's Hope estate.
Yes.
He owned estates in Barbuda. And so this man, if you were to equate his wealth and all that he would have made, he would probably been a millionaire
Astronomical.
off of what he would have earned from these estates. And so the hypocritical thing about it is, this man spent his entire life as a slaver, as a plantation owner, as an oppressor. And then when he dies, he leaves in his will, oh, I want money to be set aside to build a college in Barbados to train the priests of the Anglican Church. And that place was built at the expense of slaves and black people.
Monuments in the U.S. for individuals who were associated
With slavery.
negatively
Yes.
associated
Yes.
with slavery.
Yes.
George Washington,
Yes.
he was a slave owner
Yes.
and he was a president.
Yes.
It looks as if his statues might eventually go. So maybe it's time we Caribbean people,
Think about removing some
instead
of
of sitting and watching MSNBC and Fox and Al Jazeera and everything, and we make comments about what is happening in the US and China and all, we need to do some introspection, look at our history, and make some changes too.
Yeah.
a lot of
Because
things
we're
need to
still
change here.
enslaved psychologically
Yes.
in some instances.
And but in addition to what Kamali is saying, these people honestly believe that they were being Christians.
And they were doing good.
Beat my slave today, I go to church tomorrow, hallelujah, amen. And we're fine. Monday, beat another slave, Tuesday, do the same thing.
So it was a
Like
necessary
kill a
evil.
slave on a Wednesday and go to church,
Go to church on the Sunday.
And it's quite all right.
And it's quite okay.
Why? Because we're civilizing them and we're bringing
So
them
you're
to
doing
God.
us a favor.
And
Yes,
so they were
they're
doing us a
pagans. They're
favor.
considered as
And
pagans.
and that was one of the
Because we were in
justifications
Africa
for
worshipping
slavery.
pagan gods.
Right.
And
so
yes.
now we're bringing you to the
and
truth
we're under
of
a
God.
curse.
And nothing is the curse of Ham.
Yes.
Nothing is wrong if you're attempting to show us a better way, because I'm open-minded to a better way. But you cannot tell me that you're beating me, you're abusing
Oppressing
me,
you.
you're oppressing me, and not only me, my family, my children who were born into slavery. And then you're telling me this is the best you can do for me. What is godly about that?
And then that is
In addition to that, the state also controlled the church. So in the earthquake of 1840, the money that was borrowed to rebuild the plantation and so on, and to rebuild the mills and so on, just about half of it went to repair the church.
The big
and
church.
the other half went to repair everything else.
So the big church is symbolic.
The big church is symbolic.
it's symbolic.
It's
It's a sign of colonialism and what exactly slavery is. Because, and you can see it all over, even in our physical, historic infrastructure. Because I remember the first time I went to St. Kitts, I went to Brimstone Hill Fortress.
Yeah, I've been there.
Massive fortress in the hills, built by slaves. So they literally had to mine stone and take it 400 feet, 500 feet.
But we don't
up
have to
in
go
the
there,
air
you know, because
to
we have them
construct
here.
A massive fortress.
We have them right here. We have a lot of them
Fort
here.
George,
We have so many of
Shirley
them
Heights.
here.
You have Fort James.
We have a lot of forts here, so we don't even have to go to Brimstone Hill.
And of course,
we have them right here, and it's
and
slaves.
that's the reality. And so that's why when people call for these things to be renamed and for some of these people to be stricken from history, it is justifiable. Because I remember at one point in time, you had Nelson Street and so on in the city, and eventually they renamed them Vivian Richards Street, Nellie Robinson Street, etc., etc. And this is worth it. Even
showcase our local people.
Right, even King George V grounds, they need to find a new name for it.
Well, listen.
King George never
The
went
only name
there.
that I think they really should keep is Her Majesty's Prison.
Listen
that's,
to me.
that's practically
We're working on it. We're working on it.
Yes.
But we're at our last segment of this 3-part history program. You guys have made history, and we're now at reparations. So thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. We'll be returning momentarily. Stay with us, please. So we are at the place that I think both of you would like, and it's creating a lot of controversy across the globe. Reparation for the transatlantic slave trade. Do you realize the number of diseases that are so common within black people?
Yes.
That's
and black Caribbean people?
And that's as a result
Poor
of
nutrition.
diet. Yeah, diet.
Diet.
Poor
Because
nutrition.
Wrong diet.
Diabetes.
Wrong diet, because
Hypertension.
you brought them. You brought our ancestors from Africa. The whole diet changed. Your whole diet changed.
Exactly.
And
Eating slop now instead of fruits and vegetables that they would have grown there.
right. You know, if you look at, you go and buy a plate of lunch, a lunch, it is predominantly starch.
Yes.
Plenty rice.
Plenty.
rice.
And sometimes they give you rice,
Potato.
Potato,
And then you'll have
salad,
sweet potato.
and
Macaroni
pasta.
salad.
Yes. And
And-
then a big piece of chicken, the back and the thigh.
Yes.
Yes.
And then in
Yeah,
the
them love
corner,
chicken, but still.
A little
a
bit
little
of vegetables.
lettuce and tomatoes and something. And let me tell you, other ethnic groups, to a large degree, don't eat like us.
No,
They
but
would
that
sit
is
and
how.
cry.
They
But-
eat
but
a
you
lot
see-
of vegetables and yes,
But on the plantations, that is how people had to eat in order to fill their bellies.
the fungi, the
The-
dumplings.
the big amount of starch.
They were
Yes.
given a lot
And
of potatoes,
more
they
so,
were given
my-
saltfish, they were given a lot of flour.
Just some examples of reparations. Haiti had to pay France.
Which is very vexing. It's still vexing. France need to pay it back. And I don't know why Haiti agreed to pay it.
More than equivalent of $21 billion.
And that's why Haiti is so impoverished. Because after you'd have had the Haitian Revolution, they would have said, okay, so we're finally going to stop fighting to take back the island, but you need to compensate us for what we lost. Because at the point in time when France lost Haiti, Haiti was the
pearl of the
most
Antilles.
profitable colony in the Caribbean, and to some extent to the wider world, until
Yeah.
Britain would have colonized places like India.
So it funded the
made
lifestyle
money.
of and the
Haiti
economy
funded
of
the
France.
lifestyle
Of many
of France.
French, yes.
So then, as a matter of fact, there was a whole section, which is now the United States, called the Louisiana Colony.
Yes.
Right? Extensive expanse of land.
But the
It
US
only-
bought-
no, and they bought it. The only
Yeah.
reason why that colony existed was to supply food and stuff to make sure that Haiti continued its productivity to make money for France. And so essentially, when they would have left Haiti, they said, we'll leave you alone, but you have to compensate us. And I think even into the 1900s, Haiti was still paying France.
Yes.
And this is when Haiti is going through poverty and dictatorships and all the rest of it. Haiti still had to pay France. Even now, you have a situation where a lot of the former African colonies are still, notice that, are still paying France a colonial tax. Their reserves for their central banks are in France. And the weird thing about it is, no, that's reparation being paid to a colonizer. No, they have, been a bit hesitant in terms of paying reparations to the descendants of African slaves. The reality is, Britain has paid compensation to others before. When you look at Kenya, Kenya would have had something called the Mau Mau Rebellion, which is what would have led to their independence, where the native Kenyans said, we've had enough of British colonial rule.
But Germany, as a result of World War I,
Had to pay
Germany
compensation
had
to
to
Europe.
pay
Yes.
reparation too.
Yes.
So everybody's paying and paying and
After
paying.
the Holocaust, they also had to pay reparation to the
To the
Jews.
Jews,
as
yes.
well.
And they would have partly
In
financed
World War II,
Israel.
they had to pay.
World War II.
They had to pay reparation to the Jews, not to the black people that they killed, but to the Jews.
So let me ask you something. What are your thoughts? I mean, now that we've set the tone and demonstrated to our audience that reparation is nothing unique. We're not asking for anything that's novel, anything that's new. What are your thoughts on reparation?
In the very early stages of colonialism, they began to subjugate the people, the indigenous people of the Caribbean. They basically committed genocide. At one point, the church, the Catholic Church, said that what is happening to these people is an evil thing, but it is a necessary evil so that we can grow. The Spanish country
Church
could grow. The Catholic Church said that, and that in itself is justification for reparation. Because if you knew 400 years ago that what you're doing to these people was an evil thing, then you need to pay us back. Both for the indigenous population.
So that's an admission.
That is an admission.
That it is wrong.
It was an admission even before the fact.
So reparation for you?
Yes, 100%.
Reparation.
What about you?
For me, as Ms. Black would have said, if you can know that it is wrong and you still did it, you deserve punishment.
And we're not asking the Reparation Commission, they're not asking only for Africans, they're asking for the indigenous people that the Europeans met as well. So black people are not being greedy. The Kalinagos and the Taínos and so on. They are asking for those people because you met them here and you committed genocide.
Millions of them were killed in the space of 30 years. Wow.
Listen.
In the space of 30 years.
Listen.
They were wiped out. And so what we are asking for, we are asking for an apology.
No, but wait. What do you want? It's material and symbolic.
You're asking for
and
both.
There's individual and there's collective.
Everything.
So for material, that's payments in cash or negotiable instruments, and that could be provisions for education, health, housing. Symbolic, that will be official apologies, the change of names of public spaces, the establishment of days of commemoration, the creation of museums and parks, those recreational centers. Do you want material, symbolic, or all?
Well, I do follow the Reparation Commission in Antigua. I'm not a member, but I do follow what they do. And I need to, first of all, say that Mr. Dobin Ahmad and the others are doing a really good job. You know,
I've heard him on the big issues recently, and he made a good case.
He is doing an excellent job on it. Yes, he is. And they have we have a 10-point plan. And it includes all of that. Apology, material thing. But let me make this more practical. Let me bring it home for you.
Yes, because this is the end of the segment.
I studied in Liverpool, where there was a port.
It was a slave port there.
It was a slave port. I studied in Liverpool about 10 years ago. And my tuition was 4 times more than that of a student in Liverpool. And Antigua was a colony of Britain. We still pay allegiance to the Queen, but I had to pay 4 times more.
And you're part of the Commonwealth.
And I'm part of the Commonwealth, thank you. I had to pay my tuition as an international student. France and Britain always fighting. And a student from France who was in my class paid less than what I paid.
They're neighbors.
So a British student paid £1,500 for her master's. The French student paid £3,000 for his, and I paid over £8,000 for mine.
Wow. What a disparity.
And you're telling me that we don't deserve reparation? My great-great-great-grandmother and grandfather worked on plantations to build Britain. And then you're telling me that I have to pay international fares as a student for a country that still owes allegiance to the Queen? That is wickedness.
And on that note, that's passionate. Mr. Mannix?
For me, it even goes beyond that. Because reparations is something that can be justified and justified easily.
And we've already done
Britain, first of all, let's start here. If you were to calculate the amount of slaves taken out of Africa, Britain took the most. When you look at it, these people would have earned extensive amounts of wealth off of the British territory.
They were called sugar barons.
They were called sugar barons because of how much money they made, and the persons who invested in sugar became members of the House of Lords, and members of the House of Commons.
Some of them didn't even know what to do with the money.
They had so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. And now the descendants of the people who made you a first world state, they're now ostracized.
Scorned.
And their minds of assisting us diplomatically is giving us $13 million to rebuild Airport Road and Fries Hill Road. Absolutely unacceptable.
What do you want?
I prefer the assistance in terms of the development of public infrastructure.
And health.
And
Health. We need a
Well, of course,
hospital.
health ties into
Education.
it.
Education.
But all of our
Education.
public
Don't come and give me
infrastructure
money in my
at large.
hand.
Right.
Give scholarships.
Give a hospital.
Yes.
Advance our university.
Yes.
Build some secondary schools. Upgrade some primary schools. That is what we, not that we're not begging you for it. This is what we deserve.
Invest in Liat.
You have a point.
I'm being creative.
You have a
Invest in
point.
Liat. We need
Right.
regional transportation.
It is-
you transported the slaves all across the region.
Then that means you can
and you didn't have no
transport us.
problem with that. So now you can help us
After
with
I left
transportation.
Liverpool, only to find out when I left Liverpool that there was a slave owner who actually donated one of the buildings. And when I was there studying, I went to another library, and a whole wing, huge, bigger than this building, a wing, big. And he was a slave master. And he left all of his money, all of this wealth. He had, there were books in that place that's valued £6 million.
Can you imagine?
And I'm thinking, you know, we need to just sell
We
these
could get
books,
some.
auction these books off and send the money back to the Caribbean.
Okay, so I'm wrapping up this segment. You guys have done an excellent job, a compelling presentation. And I don't know how they say that we don't represent well in Antigua and Barbuda, and they have to bring consultants and all sorts of people. I mean, you guys are so knowledgeable. I would be privileged to be on a global stage with you. When the Paula Show goes global, I'm going to invite you for one of those global shows. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. Anything is possible in life. So listen, we're wrapping up the third part of our three-part show. And just a sentence that you would want to leave with my audience as a key message, not a paragraph, just a sentence, one line, something that will resonate in the minds of adults and young people.
My one sentence is, as black people, we are aware of where our struggle began. As persons who are now liberated and knowledgeable, it is up to us to write the ending of our story.
I like that.
For me, it is simply know your history, know the
your
truth,
history.
know the truth, acknowledge the truth, then you reconcile the truth.
All right. And for me, it is enjoying your blackness. Don't make any changes to your skin. Don't make any changes to any part of your body because you want to represent another ethnic group. Be proud to be black. And slavery did happen over 400 years, but we must be determined that it will never happen again. Not in our lifetime, neither the lifetime of future generations. Thank you very much for watching The Paula Show, and have a good evening.
The Paula Show is on.